Angola, 1622. A Portuguese governor sits on his throne, looking down at the African delegation that's just arrived for peace negotiations. There's only one chair in the room, his. The message is clear: kneel before me or stand like a servant while I sit like a king. But the leader of the African delegation doesn't kneel, and she doesn't stand awkwardly while he lords over her. Instead, she snaps her fingers. One of her servants drops to her hands and knees, and this African leader, this woman, sits on her servant's back, positioning herself at the exact same height as the Portuguese governor. Eye to eye, equal to equal. Her name was Nzinga Mbande, and for the next 40 years, she would make the Portuguese Empire regret ever underestimating her. This is Recorded Mortals. Hit subscribe because this story is about to get wild.
In history class, they teach you about European explorers, the brave conquistadors, the civilizing colonizers. They don't teach you about the African rulers who looked those colonizers in the eye and said, "Not here, not today, not ever." Queen Nzinga was one of those rulers, and her story is everything they don't want you to know about African resistance. She was a brilliant diplomat who outsmarted European politicians, a military strategist who fought the Portuguese for 4 decades, a gender-bending ruler who dressed as a man, took the title of king, and kept a harem of men dressed as women, and a survivor who went from princess to refugee to queen to legend. But here's what makes her story even more remarkable. She did all of this in the 1600s, when European powers were carving up Africa, when the slave trade was booming, when African kingdoms were falling one by one. Everyone said resistance was impossible. Nzinga proved them wrong.
If you want the real story, the one that doesn't make it into the sanitized history books, you're in the right place. Let's talk about the warrior queen who refused to kneel. Nzinga Mbande was born around 1583 in Dongo, in what is now Angola. Her father was Ngola Kilwanji. Ngola means king, which is where the name Angola comes from. So yeah, her father was literally the king. But Nzinga wasn't supposed to rule. She was a woman, and her father had sons. According to tradition, one of her brothers would inherit the throne. Nzinga would be married off to secure some political alliance, maybe have some children, and disappear into the background of history. That's how it was supposed to go. But here's the thing about Nzinga. She never cared much about how things were supposed to go. From childhood, she was different. While other princesses learned domestic skills, Nzinga demanded to train with the warriors. She learned military strategy, weaponry, horseback riding. She studied diplomacy and languages. She learned Portuguese, the language of the enemy, because she understood that knowledge is power. And she watched. She watched as the Portuguese arrived on their shores in the early 1500s, claiming they wanted to trade. She watched as that trade turned into something much darker. Let's talk about what the Portuguese actually wanted. They called it trade. They built a fort at Luanda in 1575 and said they wanted to establish commercial relationships. But what they really wanted was human beings. By the time Nzinga was born, the Atlantic slave trade was in full swing, and Angola was becoming one of its major sources. The Portuguese had a system. They'd form alliances with some African kingdoms, giving them guns and European goods. Then they'd encourage those kingdoms to wage war on their neighbors. The prisoners of war would be sold to the Portuguese as slaves. It was brilliant and evil. Get Africans to enslave other Africans, then ship those enslaved people to Brazil, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Portugal was making massive profits. The plantation economies of the New World ran on African bodies, and Angola was the hunting ground. Ndongo, Nzinga's kingdom, was supposed to be an ally. They'd signed treaties with Portugal, but the Portuguese kept pushing. More land, more slaves, more control. They wanted to turn Ndongo from an independent kingdom into a Portuguese colony. And Nzinga's father, King Kilowanji, was desperately trying to hold them back. King Kilowanji fought the Portuguese for years, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through war. But the Portuguese had guns, cannons, European military technology. Ndongo had traditional weapons, spears, bows, shields, brave warriors, brilliant tactics, but they were outgunned. The wars dragged on. Ndongo was slowly losing ground. In 1617, King Kilowanji died. Some say from stress, others say he was poisoned. The specifics don't matter. The Portuguese pressure killed him either way. His son, Nzinga's brother Ngola Mabande, became king. And this is where things get complicated. Because Ngola Mabande was, well, let's just say he wasn't his father's equal. He was paranoid, weak, easily manipulated. One of his first acts as king, he had Nzinga's son killed. Why? Because he was afraid Nzinga might use her son to claim the throne. He also had her brother killed and possibly tried to poison Nzinga herself. So yeah, family dynamics were tense. But despite all this, when the Portuguese demanded negotiations in 1622, Ngola Mabande knew he needed someone smart to represent Ndongo. Someone who spoke Portuguese, someone who understood European diplomacy, someone who couldn't be intimidated. He sent his sister. He sent Nzinga. Picture this. 1622, Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital. Nzinga arrives at the governor's palace with her delegation. She's in her late 30s, wearing traditional Ndongo royal attire, carrying herself with absolute confidence. She's there to negotiate a peace treaty, to try to get the Portuguese to stop their aggressive expansion, to buy her kingdom some breathing room. The Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, thinks this will be easy. She's a woman, an African, representing a losing kingdom. He'll dictate terms and she'll accept them. So he stages a power move. He sits on his throne and he makes sure there's no chair for her. The message, you can kneel or stand, but either way, you're beneath me. This is a test, a psychological dominance game. And Nzinga sees it immediately. If she kneels, she accepts inferiority. If she stands while he sits, same message. So she does something neither humble nor submissive. She snaps her fingers. One of her ladies-in-waiting drops to hands and knees, and Nzinga sits on her back, a human chair, raising herself to the governor's exact eye level. The room goes silent. The Portuguese are shocked. The audacity, the cleverness, the absolute refusal to accept a subordinate position. And from that position, equal height, eye to eye, Nzinga begins negotiations, not as a subject, as an equal. Nzinga spoke perfect Portuguese. She'd studied European law, Christian theology, diplomatic protocols. She argued her case with the precision of a lawyer and the authority of royalty. She pointed out that Ndongo was a sovereign kingdom recognized in previous treaties, that the Portuguese had violated those treaties repeatedly, that the slave raids were illegal under Portugal's own laws. She was brilliant, articulate, unshakable. The governor was impressed despite himself. This wasn't some savage he could dismiss. This was a formidable opponent. They negotiated for days, and somehow, impossibly, Nzinga got concessions. Portugal agreed to withdraw from some occupied territories, to return some prisoners, to respect Ndongo's borders. It was a diplomatic victory. But there was a condition. Nzinga had to convert to Christianity. Now, this might seem like a huge concession, like she'd betrayed her own culture. But Nzinga understood something the Portuguese didn't. She was playing a long game. In 1622, Nzinga was baptized as Ana de Sousa, taking the name of the governor's wife, who served as her godmother. The Portuguese thought they'd won. They'd Christianized an African princess, brought her into the fold. She'd be their ally now. But Nzinga saw baptism as a political tool, not a spiritual surrender. If becoming Christian gave her diplomatic advantages, access to Portuguese courts, legal protections under Christian law, leverage in negotiations, fine, she'd be Christian. She'd play their game, learn their rules, and then beat them at it. This is what made Nzinga so dangerous. She understood that resistance isn't always about direct confrontation. Sometimes it's about infiltration, adaptation, strategic flexibility. She'd use Christianity when it helped her, abandon it when it didn't. She'd make alliances with the Portuguese when necessary, break them when possible. She refused to be bound by anyone's rules, African or European. And she was about to need all that flexibility, because when she returned to Ndongo with her negotiated peace treaty, she found her kingdom in chaos. Her brother, King Ngola Mbande, had died, under mysterious circumstances. Some say illness, others say poison, and many whispered that Nzinga herself had arranged it. Whether she did or not, the result was the same. The throne was empty, and Nzinga was about to take it. 1623, Nzinga declares herself Queen of Ndongo. Not Queen Regent, not Queen Consort, not Princess. Queen, ruler, sovereign. This was controversial. Ndongo had never been ruled by a woman. The noble families weren't happy. Some of her brother's supporters claimed she'd murdered him. But Nzinga didn't care about tradition or approval.
She had the diplomatic credentials. She'd negotiated with Portugal. She had the intelligence and military knowledge. She had the political savvy. And most importantly, she had the will to power. If anyone wanted to challenge her, they were welcome to try. Nobody did. Nzinga was queen. But being queen came with an immediate, massive problem. The Portuguese peace treaty she'd negotiated, Portugal wasn't honoring it. Shocking, I know. European colonizers breaking treaties with African kingdoms. Who could have predicted? The Portuguese were still raiding for slaves, still occupying Ndongo territory, still pushing for total control. Nzinga tried diplomacy again. It failed. She tried military resistance, but Ndongo was still outgunned. And then, in 1626, the Portuguese launched a massive military assault. They wanted Nzinga gone. They wanted Ndongo conquered. They wanted to install a puppet ruler they could control. Nzinga's capital fell. Her kingdom collapsed. She was forced to flee. Most rulers in her position would have given up, accepted exile, faded into history as another African kingdom conquered by European guns. But Nzinga wasn't most rulers. Nzinga fled east into the interior of Angola to a kingdom called Matamba. Matamba was smaller than Ndongo, less organized, further from Portuguese power. And Nzinga saw she didn't arrive as a refugee begging for asylum. She arrived as a conqueror. Within a year, she'd overthrown Matamba's ruling family and declared herself Queen of Matamba. So now she had a new kingdom, a new base, a new chance to resist. But she was still badly outnumbered, still outgunned. The Portuguese controlled the coast, the forts, the trade routes. Nzinga needed allies. She needed weapons. She needed leverage. And then she found it. In the 1620s and 1630s, the Portuguese weren't the only European power in Africa. The Dutch were challenging Portuguese dominance, and they hated each other. Portugal and the Netherlands were at war in Europe. That war extended to Africa. So when the Dutch heard about an African queen fighting the Portuguese, they saw an opportunity. And when Nzinga heard about Europeans fighting the Portuguese, she saw an opportunity. In 1641, the Dutch seized Luanda, the Portuguese colonial capital, with Nzinga's military support. Suddenly, Nzinga had European allies, access to guns, cannons, and military training, a common enemy. For 7 years, Nzinga and the Dutch worked together, pushing the Portuguese out of Angola's interior.
This was Nzinga's golden age. She controlled Matamba. She'd reclaimed parts of Ndongo. She had European backing. She was winning. But there was a problem with European allies. They're Europeans. In 1648, the Portuguese recaptured Luanda. The Dutch cut their losses and withdrew from Angola. And just like that, Nzinga's European allies abandoned her. She was alone again, back to square one.
Most people would have given up. She was in her 60s now. She'd been fighting for decades. She'd lost kingdoms, allies, probably thousands of soldiers. But Nzinga kept fighting. For the next decade, she waged guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese, hit-and-run tactics, alliances with other African kingdoms, strategic retreats, ambushes. She couldn't defeat Portugal militarily, but she could make occupying Angola so expensive, so difficult, so bloody that they'd negotiate. And slowly, exhaustingly, it worked. By the late 1650s, the Portuguese were tired. They'd spent decades trying to conquer one woman's kingdom. They'd lost thousands of soldiers, spent fortunes. And Nzinga was still there, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. In 1657, Portugal finally agreed to a treaty. They recognized Nzinga as Queen of Matamba. They agreed to respect her borders. They stopped trying to conquer her kingdom. Nzinga had won. Not total victory. The Portuguese still controlled the coast, still ran the slave trade, but she'd kept her kingdom independent. She'd fought the Portuguese Empire for 40 years, and she'd survived. But there's one more part of Nzinga's story we need to talk about, the part that makes her even more fascinating and even more controversial.
Here's something they definitely don't teach in school. Queen Nzinga didn't always call herself queen. Sometimes she called herself king. She dressed in men's clothing. She carried weapons like a warrior. She refused to be addressed with female titles. And most famously, she kept a harem of men. Young men selected for their looks who lived in her palace. They dressed in women's clothing. They were called her wives. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. Historical accounts of Nzinga's gender performance come from Portuguese sources, her enemies. They were scandalized by her behavior, so they wrote about it extensively, often with a tone of moral outrage. So we have to take some of these accounts with skepticism. The Portuguese had every reason to portray Nzinga as deviant, as unnatural, as violating gender norms. But even accounting for exaggeration and bias, it's clear that Nzinga deliberately played with gender in ways that were shocking to both her enemies and her own people. Why would she do this? There are several theories. Theory 1. Political necessity. In most African kingdoms of this era, only men could be rulers with full authority. By taking on male titles, male clothing, and male roles, Nzinga was claiming full sovereign power. She wasn't queen consort or queen regent, positions defined by relationships to men. She was the ruler, the king, the sovereign. Theory 2. Military authority. Warriors followed kings into battle, not queens. By presenting as masculine, Nzinga commanded respect from her soldiers. She fought alongside them, led them into combat, shared their hardships. Her gender performance was military strategy. Theory 3. Power reversal. The harem of men dressed as women was a deliberate inversion of patriarchal norms. In a world where women were possessions, Nzinga made men her possessions. It was a power move, a statement, I will not be constrained by your gender rules. Theory 4. Personal identity. Maybe Nzinga simply didn't identify as a woman in the way her society expected. Maybe her gender expression was authentic to who she was. We don't have her own words on this, only what others say about her, but it's possible she was what we might today call gender nonconforming or non-binary. Now, about those wives. Portuguese sources claim Nzinga had dozens of young men in her palace, dressed as women, available for her pleasure. They say she'd execute any man who failed to satisfy her sexually. This sounds dubious. It's very similar to European stereotypes about savage sexuality. But there definitely were men in her court who held positions traditionally held by women, men who wore women's clothing, men who were called her wives. What was really going on? Most likely, this was political theater. Nzinga was making a statement. I have the power of a king, including the power to keep a harem. I will invert your gender expectations because I am above your rules. Whether she was actually sleeping with these men, whether she was attracted to men, women, or both, we don't know.
What we do know is that Nzinga used gender as a weapon. She broke the rules deliberately, strategically, to assert her authority in a world that said women couldn't be rulers. And it worked. After the 1657 peace treaty, Nzinga ruled Matamba in relative peace for the last years of her life. She was in her 70s. She'd fought for 4 decades. She'd earned her rest. In her final years, she did something unexpected. She returned to Christianity. Seriously this time. She invited Catholic missionaries to Matamba. She built churches. She promoted Christian education. Some historians see this as genuine religious conviction. Others see it as one final strategic move, securing European recognition of her kingdom, protecting it from future Portuguese aggression. Knowing Nzinga, it was probably both. She was always able to hold multiple truths at once. On December 17, 1663, Queen Nzinga died peacefully in her palace. She was about 80 years old. She'd outlived most of her enemies. She'd kept her kingdom independent. She was buried in her royal robes, carrying her bow and arrows, a warrior to the end. So who was Queen Nzinga really? Was she a hero? A freedom fighter who resisted European colonialism? Was she a tyrant? A ruler who killed rivals and kept a bizarre court? Was she a brilliant diplomat, a military genius, a gender revolutionary? The answer is all of the above. Nzinga was complex, contradictory, human. She fought against slavery, but she also participated in the slave trade when it was strategically necessary. She embraced Christianity only when it served her political goals. She challenged gender norms, but she also lived in a patriarchal society and had to work within those constraints. She wasn't a perfect hero. She wasn't a simple villain.
She was a ruler trying to keep her people free in an impossible situation, and she succeeded longer than almost anyone else in her position. Today, Nzinga is a national hero in Angola. There are statues of her, streets named after her. She's on money. She's taught in schools. But in the West, most people have never heard of her, because her story doesn't fit the narrative we're taught about colonialism. We're taught that African kingdoms fell easily, that resistance was futile, that colonization was inevitable. Nzinga's story says, no, it wasn't easy, it wasn't inevitable, and they fought like hell. For 40 years, one woman held off an empire. She refused to kneel. She refused to surrender. She refused to accept that her kingdom was anyone's to take. And when the Portuguese finally gave up trying to conquer her, they called it a peace treaty. But Nzinga knew what it really was, a victory. History remembers the myth, the obedient colonial subjects, the inevitable march of empire, the civilizing mission. We record the mortal, the warrior queen who sat on a human throne, fought an empire for 40 years, and won. If this changed how you see African resistance to colonialism, hit that like button. If you want more stories about the badasses they don't teach you in school, subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment. What other African leaders should we cover? And what do you think about Nzinga's gender-bending strategy? Thanks for watching Recorded Mortals. We'll see